This is the briefest hello. Can you hear me? Perfect. Louder? Okay. It's shyness that's suddenly coming along. Thank you very, very much for being the most crowded event that we've ever had in this building, and I am thrilled. Siobhan Davis, that would make it clear. Isaac Julian, whom I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart for curating these 3 talks which have animated this building and brought discussion into it at a level that I want very, very much and I aspire to in the future. So let's make this something that happens regularly. I would also like to thank Mark, Yvonne and Catherine for being part of these series of conversations on expanding choreographic imagination, which for me is important. So if this was just a private event, I would be learning something about pushing my borders and the appreciation I have for the choreographic art form, which I think is extraordinary. And I'm going to hand over to Isaac now, and again, a big thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you all to this last in the series of Parallel Voices, which has now been in its 2nd year. This series which focuses on performance of the visual arts and moving image, which has been created by myself, but with the patience and support of Sue, Siobhan Davis, who's generously invited me to create this series in this wonderful space. And I'm indebted to her kindness and her support. Also of Alison Proctor, who has put up with all my insistent demands. And I'd like to also thank Nina Baker, who's worked on the publicity for this series. This series, which is entitled Expanding Choreographic Imaginations, is designed to discuss the relationship between visual arts performance and their creative evolution. And I think Yvonne Rainer, for me, exemplifies and is exemplary in terms of this approach in her work. Her use of camera work, sound, the body, the ways in which the interrelated conversations and practices that have developed in her artistic practice interact and contaminate one another. And I think because of her work today, we can see a wide variety of artistic visual art practices in the cinema, in video art, in dance, in theatre, performance, architecture, which for me indicates the epistemological break which she produced in her sort of early works. And for me, it's very important to trace these trajectories, this sense of expanding the choreographic imagination, by sort of ending with this presentation and conversation. I'd like to also think a little bit about the work of Catherine Wood, who's going to be in conversation with Yvonne Rainer, who is the creator of contemporary art and performance at Tate Modern, whose recent projects, I think, has been at the forefront of really thinking about this question. The World as a Stage, which she co-created with Jessica Morgan, I think was incredibly important, along with her live programs for the Tate, including Actions and Interruptions, a program of performance interventions in the museum. And she really introduced me to Pablo Bronstein, who I was delighted to share in conversation last time, and of course is the author of Yvonne Rainer, The Mind is a Muscle, which is an exemplary text on her work. Beside her, we have Mark Nash, who is a creator and writer on contemporary art, specializing in contemporary fine art and moving image practices and the avant-garde and world cinema, head of the Department of the Creating Contemporary Art Department at Royal College of Art. He most recently curated Experiments with Truth at the Fabric Workshop Museum in Philadelphia, 2004-2005, and the Prayer Portobello at MoMA in New York in September 2007. He was also co-creator of Documenta 11, 2002, and creator of the Film Hub Berlin Biennale in 2004. And it was obviously Mark's introduction to Yvonne Rainer, which I have to thank him for fantastic insight and important introduction to Yvonne's work, which I was privileged to see in the mid-90s. Yvonne Rainer, who needs no introduction, was born in San Francisco in 1934. She trained as a modern dancer in New York and began to choreograph her own work in 1960. She was one of the founders of the Judson Dance Theatre in 1962, a movement that proved to be a vital force in modern dance in the following decades. Between 1962 and 1975, Rainer presented her choreography throughout the US and Europe. In 2000 and 2001, Rainer returned to dance via commissions from the Dance Foundation to choreograph the work of White Oak, Brinishnikov Dance Foundation, to choreograph for the White Oak Dance Project, including a 35-minute piece called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. And since 1972, Rainer has also completed several feature films, beginning with the Liza performance, which you may have saw downstairs, 1972, and more recently, The Man Who Envied Women, 1985, Privilege in 1990, and Murder in 1976. Yvonne has received numerous awards and fellowships from her work, including Guggenheim Fellowships 1969 to 1988, 3 Rockefeller Fellowships, the Genius Award from the MacArthur Fellowship, and a Wexner Prize, as well as 4 honorary doctorates of fine art degrees. Yvonne Rainer has published as well work 1961 to 73, which was published by Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and New York University Press in 1974. The Films of Yvonne Rainer, a collection of her film scripts, was published by Indiana University Press in 1989, and A Woman Who, Essays, Interviews and Scripts, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 1999. And Rainer's latest choreographic work, or she'll be talking to us about her choreographic work that she's making at this particular moment. But the first piece which I'd seen recently was Agon, was presented at the Dance Theatre Workshop in April 2006. And I think we're going to be really in this very vital part of really delving into these trajectories. It's precisely the choreographic imagination of Yvonne Rainer which I think we need to explore, to relocate in the archives, both of moving image practices, where the history of different artistic disciplines resonate. So, without further ado, I'd like to open this panel, and I'm so privileged and honored that you came to share your thoughts with us, Yvonne. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. A couple of technical remarks before we delve in. If you can't hear any of us, do speak up, especially at the beginning, and we'll get the levels right. I'm going to try and speak for as short a time as possible because we really want to hear what Yvonne's got to say. So I thought I would just introduce and say something about how I got to know Yvonne's work. As Isaac said, you have somebody from the world of performance, Catherine, myself really from the world of film, both involved in the moving image and curating. And I got to know Yvonne's work in the late 70s from the films such as Lives as Performance, which we chose to show you downstairs, as part of a body of experimental and avant-garde cinema, which was being championed here in the UK by feminist film theorists and critics such as Claire Johnston, Pam Cope, Laura Mulvey, and others. As I recall, in this period, the late 70s, there was relatively little curiosity about the connection with 1960s performance and or even New York conceptual minimalist work. So this presence of people today is a real sort of sea change. In the 70s, there was, I don't think, that kind of interest at all. I'm not, in fact, quite sure when we first met Yvonne, but I have the feeling...
I know.
Oh, do you want to tell me?
Edinburgh, 1976.
Okay. Because my and then, yeah, because it was certainly in the 70s, and you were you working on Journeys to Berlin then, or no?
I had just finished Christina Talking Pictures, and it was being shown at the film festival there. Yeah.
And I've gotten to know Yvonne and her work since then. And what was also important in that period was that a number of the performers that you were working with, and we've seen them downstairs in Lives of Performers, like David Goulden, Viola Setterfield, also Steve Paxton, performed here in London at the Riverside Studios. And so there was quite a conversation going on in conceptual dance at that period, which somehow then didn't develop in the 90s in the same way. It may be that London and New York were talking more along the lines of the way the experimental film scenes talk to each other. I don't know. And another key moment was in the early 80s when you were involved with the reconstruction of the Judson performances in this East Village Church in New York, and I can't remember the name of the St. Mark's Church
yes,
in 81. And that was the same year that an artist, theatrical impresario, I'm not quite sure what you'd call him, Mel Gordon, was involved in recreation of Maya Hall training exercises. So on the one hand, there was this interest already in the early 80s in recreating the Judson period, and on the other, in looking again at the history of performance and alternative histories of theatrical performance. Finally, in the final remark, before I draw to a conclusion and ask a few questions more directly, I remember when I began to work in New York with your friend and the editor of The Independent at that time, Martha Giver, that you were working on Murder and Murder, the last film, which was screened in Berlin in '97. And that, as I recall, was a rather difficult and drawn-out production because the funding for independent film in the States, as in the UK, had already begun to collapse. You play several roles in this film, including the master of, or mistress of ceremonies, echoing the roles of magicians and entertainers in your early work. And I remember thinking, if not saying, that if film was so difficult, it might be interesting to return to performance work that you'd begun in the 60s. And in fact, a few years later, as Isaac said, around 2000, then you began to develop these new dance or performance projects. So in a way that I'm moving towards a sort of observation which might turn into a question about the movement from performance to film and back to performance. But then reading Catherine's book, which I'm just going to, just in case anybody hasn't seen it, that's what it looks like in the bookshop.
Thank you.
Well, Catherine can't do it herself. And, it made it clear to me that in a way the concerns you were already developing in your earlier performance work, like using everyday gestures, interruptions of movement with text and spoken word, recycling elements of popular culture, are actually continued in the film work and again more recently in performance work. So you might in fact not be terribly interested in talking about this film-dance relationship. You might be more interested in the continuities, but in a way the first question that I had was about that. And I'm sorry I'm going on a bit, but that's the first question, film and dance. The second question concerns your thought on the art world today and your role as an artist and choreographer in that world, because your work being so focused on anti-market, oppositional, critical ideas has a particular edge. And I think one of the reasons why people are interested in, particularly in your work today, is two things. One is the desire of contemporary institutions to renew the language of contemporary art by incorporating film and performance. And then the second is, I think, because you offer a new, or rather actually an older, form of ideological, and I say institutional critique, which people feel very much in need of today, because people are beginning to try and rethink these issues. So there's a question about the art world, and then third, which is something that I think Sorry, is that better? And the third and final one is to do with curating performance today, which I think is something that Catherine and myself can talk with you about a little bit later on. How do we find questions appropriate to today in the work of the recent past without getting too attached to them, however important they are? And in a way, that might be an opportunity for you to talk about your more recent projects, because in a sense your work is always looking back and looking forward, so that we don't get too caught up in an archival sort of fetishism, even though it's fantastic now to be able to see the range of early work that's here. So that's sort of all I wanted to say as a sort of overview, sketch out a few themes that we might try to come back to. I'll now kind of move on to my position of chair and help stimulate Catherine in talking with Yvonne. We'll talk for about half an hour and then open it up to the floor, and I know lots of you will want to talk directly to Yvonne about a whole range of issues. So over to Catherine. I don't know whether any of the questions I raised there prompts something you want to ask to Yvonne.
Well, to your questions, I've got a whole other sub-layer of questions on the same themes, really. And I wanted to start with this relationship between film and performance, just because it points to so many issues about image making in your work, whether images on a stage, the kind of live tableau, or the images you've made for film, but also your relationship to the idea of the image that was current in the 60s in terms of the society of the spectacle. And I thought a good place to begin was your statement that you wrote as a parallel to, as part of The Mind as a Muscle, which in my book I've talked about as perhaps the most complete manifestation of your aesthetic of ordinary dance, that also contained the piece Trio A. And in the statement you describe your concept for the piece, and towards the end you talk about the fact that ideological issues have no bearing on the nature of the work. And this is in the context of the Vietnam War in 1968. You wrote, "The world disintegrates around me. My connection to the world in crisis remains tenuous and remote. I can foresee a time when this remoteness must necessarily end, though I cannot foresee exactly when or how the relationship will change, or what circumstances will incite me to a different kind of action. Perhaps nothing short of universal female military conscription will affect my function. In brackets, the ipso facto physical fitness of dancers will make them the first victims. Or a call for a worldwide cessation of individual functions to include the termination of genocide. This statement is not an apology. It is a reflection of a state of mind that reacts with horror and disbelief upon seeing a Vietnamese shot dead on TV. Not at the sight of death, however, but at the fact that the TV can be shut off afterwards, as after a bad Western. My body remains the enduring reality." That statement, the end of that statement in particular, has been a really important part of my understanding of your work and your relationship to politics and to entertainment culture in that particular context in America. Sorry, you can't hear me. And this idea of this split of your consciousness, that the world, the kind of, I mean, the allegedly authentic world of the news that you see on TV, that in your mind becomes conflated with the imaginary, where you mentioned the Western, and how that relates to your experience of being in space and time as a dancer. And I was interested in juxtaposing that historic work with your newer piece, Agon, where you've staged Balanchine's ballet on a monitor on stage next to dancers who kind of look at that and try to approximate the movement. And the gap is shown up between that as an ideal and the reality. So I think there are these very complex currents of imaginary reality, what the space of the stage represents. So there's a big question to start with.
Where to begin? My body remains the enduring reality. I see a lot of you are dancers or involved in dance out there, and I'm sure you can all relate to that. A dancer begins with the body in some way or another. Starting from where I sit at the moment, you see an aging body, not only an aging body, but an aged body. So how does one make dance out of that? And the other question is, how does one keep working as an artist in general? And so, now jumping back to the 60s, I can enter my work from a number of different angles. I came up through the influence of John Cage and Merce Cunningham, and Judson Church was all about expanding the very definition of dance. They called us anti-dance. I never thought of what we did, walking and running, as Steve Paxton and I used to joke. He invented walking and I claim to have invented running, but I never thought of this as not dance. It was all dance. It was people using their bodies in front of an audience. It was performance. This was before performance art. It was before artists like Vito Acconci and others used the term body art. It was dance. No matter what we did, Steve Paxton ate a sandwich in front of an audience. In one of his dances, he taped a square on the floor, and I stood in it and ate a pear. And that section of the dance lasted as long as it took to eat the whole pear. My individual experience had to do with exploring a wide range of material, including technically based art, dance that depended on my training, which was in ballet and the rigors of Cunningham classicism. By the late 60s, early 70s, I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall. I had been through some serious illness, and also I had followed experimental film for years, and began to think about a kind of filmmaking that consisted of narrative fragments with non-professional actors, performers. I called them performers, and what you saw downstairs was that was my first film. So the relation, what I took with me from dance was literally dance ideas. What you see at the beginning of that film is a rehearsal for an actual dance concert. What you hear in the soundtrack is partly an audience at that dance concert. And it contains a solo dance by Valdez Setterfield and more rehearsals of very simple maneuvers, walking, changing the direction of the upper body in contrast to the direction of the feet, with this this movement, which to me at the time represented the myths that Martha Graham had, like, I do not want to see it. It was a very dramatic, for me, it was a very dramatic gesture in the midst of this minimalist lower body movement. So from there, and film offered the possibility of dealing much more specifically with social issues, which I felt that the kind of dance that I was involved with could not accommodate. I had been involved with eclectic range of movements, very short-term narrative bursts, like someone telling a story while they're moving, but the movement had nothing to do with the story. So it was like patting your head and rubbing your belly. And I wanted to get into very social issues that the women's movement was raising, and work not only with toward narrative, but with language. At first, not with dialogue. The Lives of Performers has no synced dialogue. What you hear is the actual performers seeing a rough cut of the film and responding to it, like Shirley saying, "Oh, I look like an old-fashioned movie star," is the first time she'd ever seen herself on camera. So there is this self-referentiality in it, in those early films. There is, you see people just sitting around doing next to nothing while either intertitles or subtitles tell short melodramatic narratives. There's no coherent overview in any of those early films, no assigned characterizations. And by the time of the last film, I was using professional actors with more intricate relationships and more coherent dialogue. Returning to then what happened after '96. I kind of ran out of gas. Economically, I'd gotten every prestigious grant and award that the United States offered. And the films were getting more and more expensive. From $5,000 for the first one, it was $250,000, which of course in film terms, feature film terms, is a drop in the bucket. But even that, I saw that I could no longer, I would not be able to raise. So what to do? I wrote poetry for a year. I mean, this again is about continuing to work. And then around 2000, I was invited to, the Judson Church was putting on a benefit to raise money for a sprung-wood floor in the church, which had been linoleum over concrete. And I was invited to do something, and so I resurrected Trio A, which you saw on the monitors, and the first section of The Mind is a Muscle from 1968, and which I continued to perform and teach. And Mikhail Baryshnikov came to that performance, and it consisted of variations on Trio A. As some of you may know, one of the premises of Trio A is that the performers gaze that of the spectator. The head is always engaged in some movement that takes the gaze away. If you face the audience, the eyes are closed, etc., etc. So one section of this new performance, and I called it Trio A Pressured, was one performer doing Trio A while another ran around trying to keep her gaze in view. Another version was Pat Catterson performing it backwards. She had taught herself the exact retrograde. And then there was another version that it was a trio to the Chambers Brothers in the midnight hour. So Baryshnikov was there, and a few days later came a phone call. Hello, this is Misha Baryshnikov. Said, who? And he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I hadn't choreographed for 25 years. And he invited me to make a dance for his White Oak dance project, which at that point consisted of 6 performers, including himself, 2 men and 4 women. So with the help of the aforementioned Pat Catterson, who had studied with me in 1969, was still going strong, doing her own work, and had a memory like a steel trap. I raided my own icebox, came up with all kinds of fragments which were rearranged, and I added new work, and it became what is on one of the monitors in the form of a later video. Fragments of it went into a video, but it was called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. And my interest in film, in dance rather, was reactivated by the process of putting this dance together. And since then, I've kind of gone where the wind blows. There was a Stravinsky program in 2000, several years ago, at Dance Theater Workshop in New York, and I was invited to do something on Stravinsky. Now, I saw Agon, the Balanchine dance, choreographed for the New York City Ballet in the late 50s, shortly after, with the original cast, shortly after its inception. And it always struck me as one of these momentous events. It was an abstract ballet, no tutus, no narrative, no fairy tales. It was simply movement. And with Pat Catterson's help, we looked at a version of it from 1982. And as we went to the Performing Arts Library in New York, and she kept saying, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. And so we started to put pieces of it together, and I had these 4 women who had various experience with me, from the 30-year-old Emily Coates, who had danced with the New York City Ballet and danced with the Baryshnikov Company, Patricia Hofbauer, who collaborates with her husband, the performance artist Emilio Sanchez, George Emilio Sanchez. Sally Silvers is a well-known New York City-based postmodern choreographer, and Pat Catterson, the inimitable, indispensable Pat Catterson. So I took this dance that originally was for 8 women and 12 men, 8 women and 4 men, and I put parts of it on these 4 women. And that dance answers the question, how many postmodern choreographers does it take to partner a ballerina? Well, in this case, it took 3. And so Emily did it on point and was hoisted around by the 3 women, which was very much in keeping with my early ideas about a particular use of the body. I made a dance in 1965 for 10 performers and 12 mattresses, and a lot of the activity had to do with hoisting and carrying around these mattresses. I was very interested in the visualization of physical effort, and the dance also included choreographed technical one-legged balancing kind of movement, but then there were these stacks of mattresses that got hauled around, and we did childlike things like run and jump on them, and there's a So here we are. One of my big criticisms of ballet, of course, was from a feminist point of view early on, how the ballerina is always made to seem lighter than air by being hoisted around and I called it wheelbarrowed around. So here you saw the actual effort of three women getting this ballerina aloft, and it fulfilled the requirement of the dance to refer to the original dance. So it was like an analysis of the dance, but also something new, and especially one critic said it was about the women's solidarity. So it's very much a feminist piece. From there, the people approached me, the Getty Museum and the Getty Research Institute at the Getty Museum in LA, and Rosalie Goldberg's, the performance historian, now every 2 years organizes a series called Performa, and last year she invited me to present something, and I have always been interested in these. I consider my work to be an extension of various avant-garde traditions, you might say. There certainly is, and you can talk about an avant-garde tradition from 1900 Vienna to the Futurists in Italy, to the Dadaists in Switzerland, and et cetera, to Duchamp, John Cage, et cetera. And I consider my work to be, in a manner of speaking, if not an extension, certainly in keeping with these explorations, and also referring back to these moments. And Rite of Spring in 1913 is certainly one of those moments. And 2 years ago, or is it now 3, I was visiting my friend Alona Halberstadt, who's sitting in the first row, and she said, here's something you might be interested in. And she recorded off of the telly the BBC production called Riot at the Right. And there was this soundtrack that attempted to revive or invoke that tempestuous moment of May 29th, 1913, when the audience voiced their displeasure with this revolutionary work that defied all musical and dance traditions as they knew it. And I decided to use that soundtrack as the soundtrack for a new work. And so I needed a template, and I went to the template of Millicent Hodgson's reconstruction of Rite of Spring for the Joffrey Ballet in 1987. And with Pat Catterson, I'm not very musical, and to count that diabolical Stravinsky score was much beyond me. And again, I was very dependent on Pat's musicality, and together we said, we can do that, and we can do that, and we can do that. So you might say, and I'm really running off at the mouth here, but maybe departing from your points, but we can draw me back if you wish to. You might say, Martha Graham said once, I steal from the best, she said. And I steal from, especially since my return to dance, I steal from all kinds of people. Currently, I just finished a dance last week called Spiraling Down, and I steal from Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin and soccer and Sarah Bernhardt and newspaper photos and the Marx Brothers and a lot of other people. Okay.
You wanted to follow up with another question, Catherine.
Or what did I elide?
No, you covered nearly all.
I covered
everything.
the waterfront. Yeah.
It was when you were talking about the avant-garde tradition, I was going to ask you whether you meant, because the things you were describing were very much in a visual art vein, Dada and Duchamp. And my thinking about your work is almost that you have a conceptual practice that in some ways happens to be in the form of dance, because it doesn't, I guess that's how I've read it to some extent in my book, because you've also shifted between media and your involvement with visual art. But there is, of course, a strong element of knowledge of ballet, training with Cunningham, training with Graham, that's in there. And I wondered, in terms of this question of ballet and going back to Stravinsky and Balanchine, how much an idea of ballet haunts you, and what it meant to you in America, post-war America, this aristocratic European tradition, what it meant to the Judson dance theatre in the 60s, and what it means to revisit that now. And this kind of, your work, the recent two pieces I've seen looking at the Rite of Spring and Agon are irreverent and funny, but also there seems to be a love for that material.
Yes. Okay, very good. Ballet meant different things to different people. Like some of the Judson people never went to a ballet program. I went sort of religiously. I saw everything Balanchine did in the late 50s up through the mid 60s anyway. But I went to everything. I went to modern dance of all kinds, early modern dance. Followed Graham's work, Doris Humphrey, Limon, everybody. At Judson, ballet, yet ballet was the enemy, right? I mean, it was, and yet I went, as Lucinda Childs had said years ago in an interview, in the afternoon we all went to study ballet with Mia Slovenska, and at night we went to Yvonne's and moved mattresses around. So there was this kind of paradox. We felt, it was my generation, that we needed training, but you didn't necessarily have to adhere to that training. Like some of the most gifted, naturally gifted and highly trained people at Judson very deliberately and perversely perhaps eschewed their training. Steve in Eating a Sandwich, he was one of the most amazingly gifted and technically virtuosic people in the group. Tricia Brown was another one. She always felt that Judson was about denying, or you weren't supposed to. There were no rules there. There was all kinds of movement, not just minimal movement, not just pedestrian movement. There were all kinds of things that happened at Judson. But, and I never felt I was restricted by any proscriptions at Judson. She did, and she didn't get into the amazing capacity of her own body until late 60s. Ballet now, I mean, and going back to using Agon as what I call a template was very much a mixed project for me. First of all, I knew I would bring to bear on that standard of virtuosity, a group of a very unstandard kind of ensemble. Sally Silvers has never had a ballet class in her life. She is short and somewhat stocky. And next to her, and she's now about 50 years old, next to her is, I put them next to each other at the opening of Agon, if you know the dance. 4 men at the rear of the stage do this complicated little footwork before branching out. I put her right next to Emily Coates, who does it on point. So it was this juxtaposition that challenged me, and it still does. I'm very devoted to this particular group of people, even as they age, and each of them does the material, executes whatever material I give them in a totally different way. Sometimes the same material. They do unison movement, and the ballerina and the young ballerina and the 63-year-old modern dancer, of course, they do it quite differently. So there was this challenge of ballet. Then, of course, there's the Nijinsky work, which has nothing to do with ballet. No one is on point, no one is turned out, the feet are turned in like this, so no wonder it was an outrage in its day. Today, the movement is not such an outrage. There's all kinds of turned in movement that you see in modern dance, and to evoke that moment, and with again, with this group with these disparate histories and ages, was what interested me. So ballet, the romance of ballet is something that I collect photos, or we went through a lot of, for this new dance, we went through a lot of collections of dance photos from Ballet Russe, and at several points, one woman takes another in one of these incredible poses where the dancer is in passe, swung over the shoulder with the gazes meeting in this rapturous romantic position. It just appears out of nowhere and then dissolves. So I'm interested in these references. There's a Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse. Of course, Sid Charisse died a month or so ago, and so the photos of her and Fred Astaire are all over the place. There's some of those references, again with 2 women.
I'm stop you for a minute, Yvonne, because that's fantastically enlightening, and I'd like us to open it up to the audience. I mean, did you have one more question?
Quite a few
I'm
more.
sure you
Well,
do.
what we could do is
I've got one.
have one question from Catherine, then from the audience, and then we can come back at the end maybe to something from both of us.
Well, I just want to show them something from this new dance with you two.
Okay.
Can I do that?
Yes.
With both of you. If all of you could pull in your feet.
We haven't been told what it is that we're doing. So.
I have to give them instructions. Pull in your belongings, and we'll go off to the side, and then I'll show you something. And we come up behind you, and we go here, all right? Lower, okay, now walk. Okay. Okay. That's one of the movements from my new dance.
leads me nicely on to my next question, because I have a terrible fear of performing on stage.
You're a good sport.
No. Well, I was going to ask you, I remember in your memoirs, or in your diary, you'd written about your first experience of performance, when you first performed on stage in a theatre with James Waring. And you said that it gave you this overwhelming sensation of being in your consciousness, not being split, because you'd always had a sense in your diaries and memoirs earlier on that you were kind of, there was this self-reflexive sense of performing even when you're on your own. And then suddenly being on stage collapsed that into the present in an instant which you'd never experienced before. And I'm really fascinated by that impulse to perform and how that dynamic works for you as an individual performer. In relationship to training and to choreography and directing others as well, what the meeting point is maybe.
Well, obviously, it no longer works that way because I don't perform anymore. Yeah, it had to do with being in the moment and being totally integrated as a subject, a person, and a sense of power too. I mean, I think anyone who performs must at some point experience that. That desire to be looked at, and it's what I questioned, of course, in Trio A. Averting the gaze was a kind of critique, auto-critique, self-critique of that very impulse and need to be looked at.
And what happens with that when you're making work for others to perform on stage? Do you seek performers who have that extrovert desire? Is that something that's important in their performance?
That's up to them. I don't question their motivations. You know?
But is it something you can kind of feel from somebody if you audition? I don't know.
I've never auditioned anybody. I hate
really?
No. I work with people. I've worked with my performers. Sally came to me and said, I'd like to recreate Matt from The Mind is a Muscle from your notes. And I said, go ahead. And Patricia, I asked, she was recommended to me. I didn't know her, and as someone who could recreate another solo. And after I saw them, it was partly their interest in my work and partly that they were good performers. But now what that means, what is a good performer, that's more difficult to talk about. Yeah, I guess partly it is that that need and that sense of urgency, right? Yeah, which has to do with this feeling of necessity.
Not much hope for me and Mark.
No.
Me anyway. Maybe for Mark.
Yeah, I think we should open it out. I mean, I'm conscious that we haven't moved into the discussion of contemporary art in a way. That's fine because we've got half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, and I'm sure a number of people want to raise that and other questions. So, there's a hand up at the back already. So there's a microphone that's coming, and please try and make your question concise and focused so we can get as much input and dialogue in the time we've got.
You mentioned at the beginning, you asked the question yourself, how do you address the issue of aging as an artist? I'm curious.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
How do you address the issue of aging as an artist?
I was curious to know if the movement that you just demonstrated has anything to do with the subject of aging in your work.
Well, you just saw one example of how I mean, anyone could do that, right? You don't have to be 20 years old to do what we just did. So,
even though we're both 20 years old.
Yeah, none of us are, or we'll see it again. As the title of my new dance indicates, spiraling down. It is about aging in a sense. There's a standing microphone, and the dancers at various points come to the microphone and say some rather, how would I call them? Well, the very first thing that is said is, "I'm very sorry. You've called on a bad day. They're both dead." That's the first thing that is said. So there is an undercurrent there. There's another point where someone, it's actually about my mother who had Alzheimer's, and there's some kind of grisly moments before she was put in a home. So there's a point where someone walks and two other people run after her and just lay her out flat, which is a kind of, it's a death image, I guess. In my films, I dealt with aging, with menopause, and with aging in a lot of different ways. Not all of them dismal.
Maybe we should have like 2 or 3 questions, and then you can kind of choreograph, as it were, a response. That way we'll get a few more voices
write
through,
them down.
if that's okay. So if we could have like say 2 questions, and then everyone can respond, something like that.
I can only handle one at a time.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. That's Pablo.
Yeah, I've got a question about the city. New York, you're in New York.
Yeah. Well, for the last 3 years, I've been teaching in LA.
Right. Thank you. I was thinking about this Trisha Brown quote about the big things happening uptown with Balanchine and Judson being about the little things, and thinking about maybe that might be about bums on seats, but it might also be about different types of movement, pedestrian versus grand gestures. I don't know. So I just wanted to know how New York related to that for you, whether being downtown affected your work, whether the gentrification of downtown has affected your work, and how it relates to that.
I would change that quote. I'd rather think of, there were big things happening uptown and momentous things happening downtown, rather than little things.
I might have got the quote wrong.
I don't know it. Was the next thing about gentrification or what?
How did the fact that grand ballet was happening uptown make you guys behave downtown? And how did that start changing when gentrification started? How did the geography of the city affect your work?
Well, while I was around making work, that gentrification process had only just begun. Soho was not called Soho. It was an industrial area that few people were familiar with except artists. And it was all rags and wholesale fabric and small manufacturing. But the pattern, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Artists move into cheap lofts and abandoned industrial sites, and the real developers follow. So what you have now is people, young dancers, can no longer live even in the East Village, and they're moving further and further out. And in fact, there's a group called Shade Bushwick that is now in the far reaches of Brooklyn. But it did not affect me. I mean, in '75, I moved into from so-called Soho into a loft that is still protected. It's in Tribeca, which is one of the fanciest places in Manhattan, most expensive, but I am protected by a law that allows the rent to rise only if the landlord invests a little bit of money in bringing the place to adhere to the fire codes. And that has not happened in this building. My landlords have always been scofflaws, and which is to my advantage and disadvantage, but I won't go into that. But young artists, including, I was very fortunate at that time. I paid $40 a month rent, and everyone survived on part-time jobs or a little dispensation from their parents, and it was a whole different time. You didn't talk about real estate. You didn't talk about how you made a living. Everyone got by, and you could, as Simone Porti always says, you could get a spaghetti dinner and a glass of wine for 99 cents. So,
I was going to actually follow on Pablo's question to ask the one question that I haven't raised, which is about the psychogeography of New York and Judson as well, which Catherine touches on in her book, which is the relationship with conceptual and minimal work, because in a way we haven't talked about art, but at the same time that was all going on, and you were also involved and friendly with Reichenberg and Robert Morris and so on. But did you think... Sorry?
I think Carl Andre wrote you quite a few admiring letters.
Yes. I should talk about that. I mean, it wasn't only dance that I was going to see. It was happenings and music concerts and gallery.
Did what you were doing in Judson and your work, you saw that as a connection, having a connection, but at the same time you didn't call it art, you called it performance.
Dance.
You called it
I didn't
dance.
call it performance either. I called it dance. Yeah. Happenings were happenings. They were made by visual artists, ex-painters and sculptors, and what we did came out of our background as dancers, so we called it choreography.
And then today, with the movement into the museum and gallery space, in which that seems to frame so much of
well, it did then also. Some of my early dances happened at the Whitney Museum, the Modern Museum. Some of Elaine Summers did things. She was a Judsonite, and she did things at the Modern Museum. Tricia Brown performed at the Whitney, as did Meredith Monk, Philip Glass, Steve Reich. So the museums at that point were very involved in performance. Yeah.
I was going to say, was the dance world supporting that work as well, or it was the art?
Some of us. Simone Forti did her first work in New York at the Rubin Gallery, which was the home of the happenings. Alan Capro, Oldenburg, Robert Whitman.
Anyway, that was just to follow up on Pablo. Another question. There's one here, and then the guy in the blue T-shirt. So, well, the mic's going towards the blue T-shirt, so we'll take you afterwards.
You suggested that the body was an obvious starting point for you as a dancer. When you're writing poems, what's your starting point? What's the starting point for you there?
It's hard to say. I don't know. In some instances, nature, city life, standing in line at the post office, mundane things, observations.
But writing's always been a big part of your work,
Yes.
isn't it, as a parallel to performance.
Either
in film.
writing that appeared in performances or writing afterwards about performances, yes.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in there briefly with a supplementary question again to do with the Getty, because you put some of your material in the Getty? Was that, did they ask you, and you did that as part of your residency, or was it also your
No,
concern?
I asked them, I was aware that I didn't want to be responsible for this archive any longer, and also needed money, and so I approached them. Yeah.
Right. And there's a question here. Yeah.
Hello. My question is about your experience in teaching. If you could speak a little bit about that, or how much important is for you to teach?
What was the last part?
How much important is for you to teach, or what kind of questions?
Well, at this point, it's a living. I've done a lot of freelance teaching here and there. I began teaching something called Approaches to Performance around 1997. First in the performance department at New York University, and I began thinking about theoretical essays as a source of physical images or movement, or hoping that would develop, depending on who took the course. So in the first time I taught this, it was to performance historians mainly. And then at the Art Institute in Chicago, I had a mixture of dancers and performance artists, or would-be performance artists, and that was interesting. So I continued to teach that. I call it materials for performance, and I show video, and I have readings from everyone from Sontag to Mulvey to Judith Butler to Homi Bhabha, or all kinds of people. And sometimes it's like pulling teeth, but I remember reading theoretical material years ago and getting turned on almost physically. It was odd. The struggle to understand a conceptual material invigorated me, not only mentally but physically, and I have hoped that would happen for other people. It doesn't always happen. I still encounter this split, mind-body split, and it very much depends on people's experience. But I still make the attempt. Yeah.
And that was also very much part of your film work, was engaged with that or reflecting on that. Yes. Well, sorry, no, there's two. Helena's, and then there's somebody behind. Maybe at the end we can come back, or you can ask it on the...
Thank you. Yes, I wondered if you could say something about what it was like to work with others in exploring the movements that you were exploring, either when you were guiding people who were your contemporaries, or when you're teaching people who are new to dance. Can you say something about what it actually feels like to be making those movements and exploring those movements? Did you at the time, for example, earlier, feel that you were sharing a new sense of what movement could be? Did everyone share that together, or I know you were sometimes in the position of guiding?
You're talking about the experience with performers.
As actually, because we're a mixed audience here tonight of dancers and non-dancers, I would like to hear you describe what it's like to make those movements.
To make movement for the people I work with.
Sorry. When you, in yourself, what it's like, but do you think that the people you were working with, your contemporaries earlier on, when you were creating new kinds of movement, felt something similar to you and similar to each other?
And
now when you teach, or since when you've taught people who are not performers?
Well, of course, making a dance now is a totally different experience than making it then. And I was, as David Gordon has described me, has once said to me, you were an Amazon. I mean, I had inexhaustible energy. I was strong as an ox, and I could take 3 classes a day and still work on my own stuff at night. And I worked all the time. Communicating, and all of the movement came out of my body, pretty much, which certainly is not the case now. I mean, every now and then something erupts from this body, but not much anymore. So, which accounts for all of these sources that I've described. Okay, do this and do that, and we look at a photo, or we look at it we look at Pat Catterson's 93-year-old mother in the assisted living home, who was a professional ballroom dancer, doing little movements to Dean Martin, and in a coquettish way. That's in this dance. Pat took a video camera into the home and taped her mother, and it's very poignant. And so the dancers studied, or actually Pat made a composite of these moves and taught them to the other 3 dancers. And it's synchronous. They do them, these little, and it's very important that they get the expression right, the pleasure, the coquettish, everything is very precise. So in a way, that is as demanding as when I made movement, and I said, when I teach Trio A, certainly, especially now, it's like the hand is like this and not like that. I mean, I'm very persnickety about how it's done, and that is still in my body, and I can teach it. The video that was made as a 16mm film in 1978. I had stopped dancing for 3 years. I was not in very good shape. It's not an ideal Trio A from my point of view. And when I teach it, I show that, but I'm very critical of it. I don't plie correctly. I don't straighten my legs. I don't get the right uninflected dynamic, etc., etc. I don't know whether I've answered your question.
The woman in the black then, and
since the 60s, long time have passed, and I just wonder if you've kept track with contemporary dance. And I mean, it's amazing to see that today both the visual art and the field of dance still find your work very radical and totally groundbreaking. And I wonder, in the last 40 years, if there's at least one moment in contemporary dance that you felt was key and maybe have moved something forward.
Oh, while I was making film, I didn't keep up, I must say. I went to movies all the time and didn't keep up with dance. Since 2000, I have more or less kept up. I follow my contemporaries' work, and I've seen some things I consider very important and have moved me. Tricia Brown, Steve Paxton, who was dancing up a storm up to a few years ago. His Goldberg variations was amazing. And David Gordon's dance theater type pieces like Henry V, I don't know whether that's come here. Tricia Brown's work, which I've lost sight of in the last few years, but certainly she continues to surprise me. And then there was this group Australian group, Crunchy Move. What? Chunky Move, that made a piece called Tense Dave. I don't know whether it came here. That was pretty astounding on a moving turntable. So every now and then, I see something that perks me up and, oh wow, energizes me, yeah.
There's a question there, and one in the white.
I had a question about your piece, Hoist. I read in the description about it once in one of your books, which is very beautiful. And in it there is a pillow which always gets pulled away from the performers when they get lowered to the floor. And I find that so intriguing because it seems different to the work with mattresses and the other objects, which is more sort of logical, and this is kind of absurd.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about this development into some kind
I've used pillows quite a bit. Maybe there's some of it in this tape. It's after many of the piece I made for Baryshnikov, it's a spoof on ballet. The ballerina, who's Emily Coates, is partnered by two people who cushion her hand with a pillow, or she's standing on a pillow, or they cushion her arabesque. Yes, it's humor. They run. There's a whole movement where they run. It came from the 70s. I was working with pillows. You run and you go face down, sliding on the floor on a pillow. It's an absurd object, and in keeping with the so-called theme of the mattresses, suggests sleep. And the mattresses had a very elaborate subtext: death, illness, sleep, unconsciousness, etc.
Okay, I think we may all be slipping into unconsciousness slightly with this temperature, because you've brought us this fantastic New York weather, and I was going to...
Isaac has a question.
No, I was going to end up by asking whether Isaac or Sue had a question, and Isaac has a question, so that's great. And
well, Yvonne, I just wanted to really ask, in relationship to a sort of observation, which of course I have my own conclusions about, but I was very interested if you had a sort of theory in terms of the recent sort of interest in performance, that perhaps it guarantees a promise of a radicality that has been lost to the market. And if you think about the interest in performance, if you think about Rosalie Goldberg's Performer 05-07, and of course the recent interest, resurgent interest in both your early works and also the interest from the art world in your works. I wondered if you had a sort of theory or observation to make about that. And I say that because I think one of the differences between the kind of mind-body split which exists in the UK is precisely a certain ambivalence towards what would be seen as these gestures of radicality in your works, which would seem to be at odds with perhaps some of the curatorial kind of programming of several sort of institutions, because we have not seen your work performed here for several years. And so I wondered if you had any comment about that, both in relationship to the dance world ambivalence and the arts world perhaps recent
one manifestation in the 60s that was so different from today was a disregard for standards of professionalism. We threw it to the winds, and we were able to because we never expected to make a dime from what we did. And it made such a difference in the way we approached our work. And so, you know, my relation to the art world remains very ambivalent, although, I mean, I feel sometimes I want to bite the hand that feeds me. It has fed me and supported me, and yet when, like a gallery invites me to do things, or a museum invites me, I immediately close down. I mean, it's like when I enter a gallery, I hear cash registers, you know, and I'm surprised. I feel very sympathetic with young dancers today, that they don't have that freedom and that ease of fooling around, farting around that we had. And they have to be concerned. I mean, a dance class today costs, what, $10 or something? We paid $1.50. I mean, which certainly the rate of inflation of the dollar or the pound has the cost of dance classes and being a dancer has even far exceeded the change in the economy. I feel very privileged to have made my most important innovations in that period when it was possible to do it without economic concerns. Today, to make to make yourself visible, you have to form a company. I mean, it's one reason I left dance. I didn't want to institutionalize myself. I didn't want to form a company. I didn't want to be responsible for a group of people. One reason the Grand Union developed was that I felt I couldn't keep this very talented group of people. I couldn't make work fast enough to satisfy them, which may or may not have been true, and we became a cooperative, and so it was it became a totally improvisatory group, which I lasted for 2 years, and they went on from about 7 for 6 years. But yes, this business of having a board of directors and all this apparatus to raise money to build a building, you know, I mean, that's the most flamboyant and impressive development. But short of that, even sustaining yourself with a group of people who expect to be paid, you know, and you want to pay them, and how do you do this? And the arts grants have, the NEA, the National Endowment in the States, no longer gives individual grants. They have to go through agencies that then distribute the money, and so it just gets harder and harder, and I admire anyone who has the stamina and ambition and drive to weather all this. I don't know that I could if I were coming up today as a young dancer.
But I wondered what you thought of this sort of renewed interest in performance, because that has been a sort of interest which has been part of a sort of new development. In the visual arts, at least. I mean, you call it dance, but I think, you know, that Catherine has been trying to link that to the conceptual trajectories, you know, which one is in conversation with in your own practice. And then, of course, then relationship to film, to cinema, which you pursued, you know, which links back to, I think, this question of reception, which we haven't spoken much about, but also this question of ambivalence in terms of reception in relationship to criticism, and that general, if you like, disassociation with questions of language in your work, and what that's met with in terms of language address when it's performed and written about. If you have any views about that.
I've become more and more techno-hysteric. One reason I was glad to leave film was I'm so uncomfortable with the technology and the dependence on all these experts and the hierarchy involved in making films, and the laboratories. It seemed very indirect, and choreography, it's a very direct relation to your material, and you see it instantly, and so for me, a collaboration with media, it's very remote in my thinking. The most technological thing in this current dance is a standing microphone. So I much admire your work, of course, with what, your last piece at the Brooklyn Academy was astounding. I mean, I don't know quite what you're asking me.
Well, maybe another way of exploring it is to say, as I intended to say, I don't know whether I actually said it now, was that dance, as we're talking about it here, and also moving image practices such as Isaac's moving image art practices, are two areas in which contemporary art is renewing itself, if you like. But that's where a lot of the most interesting work is happening, and it's getting incorporated into or adopted by the museums and galleries in a different way, because
they are the ones who are supporting it. It's true. They have the resources.
They have the resources, but maybe it points to some sort of crisis in the whole economy, the imaginative aesthetic economy rather than the financial economy of the visual arts. I mean, that's just more a hypothesis. I don't know, Catherine, you maybe have some thoughts about that, because you're curating, obviously, the performance in a visual arts environment.
I think in one of the reasons an interest in performance has evolved more strongly in recent practice, looking back at the work of the last 50 years as well as what's being made now, is partly to do with the emphasis on the viewer in post-war European and American art, in happenings and in minimalist sculpture. So much that work was talked about in relation to the viewer's body. And this Brian O'Doherty's book, Inside the White Cube, kind of parodies the extent to which the viewer is staged in the White Cube gallery as a performer. But that's almost because the work itself is reduced to such a level of abstraction without figurative content, perhaps, in the most extreme way so far in art history.
Are you talking about a particular work?
Well, I'm thinking about the way Donald Judd's work or Robert Morris's work, minimalist sculpture, was talked about during its reception in terms of a physical relationship to the viewer's body. So when people were reading a review of that work, for example, they were thinking about it next to a body, which they weren't seeing when they went to look at it because they were the body. Whereas in your work, you were staging this interaction between objects and bodies and creating an equivalence that was a more tangible way of making that concept manifest. And I suppose in recent art practice in the 1990s, the whole idea of relational aesthetics was about viewers coming to a gallery and participating in something that kind of completed the work by having the viewer's body and presence there.
So how is it different from the necessity to have an audience?
Because in that work, in the artwork sense, the viewer's kind of on stage within the work. There's, in both cases, there's a strong necessity. And that's another thing I was going to ask you about, how you've always drawn an awareness of the audience and wanted a response from the audience, you've said, and how the right at the right appealed to you, maybe.
I've always kept the audience at a distance. I have no use for them except as viewers.
Well, you did say you liked an actively vocal audience who would boo or cheer, or in an interview I read with you.
But they don't penetrate the space. No, they keep
the feedback.
I like them to keep their place.
It's very honest.
Fantastic. So I think we're coming to an end, and I wonder whether, we'd obviously love to thank Yvonne for coming over and beginning what we hope is a continuing series of dialogues about both the historical side of performance and also this conceptual, very engaged, embodied practice that you represent in particular, and hope that we can have more of this and maybe a retrospective or presentation of your works here. And I was wondering whether Sue wanted to say a word or two at the end to close it, or Sue and Isaac together, because Sue's work also has certain connections, and so, I'm not asking Sue to give a presentation of her own practice now, right at 10 past 9 on a very hot Friday night, but I was wondering whether you had any reflections on this evening, Sue, as a sort of way of, sorry to put you on the spot like this, I didn't say it.
I'm just incredibly happy that we've all been able to listen to this conversation, and I think I perceive a real energy and a shift in the thinking and the embodiment of dance in this country, and conversations like this support us and help and energize, and we need to continue, and we will continue alongside conversations like that. And just an enormous thank you to everybody, and very much to Isaac as well. So a big thank you, and a continuation of Parallel Voices.